The hum of the terminal was constant, footsteps echoing across polished floors, luggage wheels rattling over tiled seams, announcements droning overhead about delayed flights and gate changes. Inside one of the country's busiest airports, travelers moved like a tide. Business people clutching coffee and phones, families corralling children, retirees navigating kiosks and flight boards. Everyone was in a hurry. Everyone had somewhere to be, and almost no one noticed the woman in the navy blue uniform walking calmly against the current. Her name tag read A. James, and her stripes, 4 sharp bars embroidered on her shoulders, declared her rank as a commercial airline first officer, a trained pilot with thousands of hours of flight time. But despite the uniform, despite the confident gait and the flight bag in her hand, the reactions she received told a different story. A white man in a rumpled business suit nearly collided with her in the crew hallway, and without looking, muttered, "Excuse me, miss," before glancing back and realizing she wasn't an airport assistant. He blinked, confused, then kept walking. A gate agent glanced up at her and said, "The flight attendant's already checked in, ma'am," before noticing the wings on her chest and quickly correcting, "Oh, sorry, pilot." "Of course." Avery nodded politely, without correcting anyone, without offering a smile she didn't feel. She was used to it. Every time she walked through a terminal, people saw the uniform, but filtered it through expectation. In their eyes, she was the anomaly that didn't quite make sense, a detail their brains tried to rearrange into something more familiar. And more often than not, that meant assuming she was anything but the person flying the plane. She kept moving, weaving through the side entrance used for crew and airline staff. Her badge beeped softly as she passed through security, nodding at the officer who gave her a quick look of recognition. He knew her, had seen her dozens of times, but still called her ma'am instead of captain or first officer. It wasn't offensive, not really. It was just one more reminder that her place in the cockpit still surprised people. And even after all these years, that surprise hadn't faded. As she neared Gate 39, she checked her watch, still on schedule. Today's flight was a full cross-country route, just under 5 hours, with a Boeing 737 she knew like the back of her hand. She had studied every system on that model, had landed it in rough crosswinds, simulated failures, handled pressure tests and real turbulence. She was more than qualified. She was exceptional, but that never seemed to matter when it came to first impressions. She reached the gate desk and introduced herself to the gate agent, who took her ID and glanced at it with thinly masked confusion before saying, "You're the pilot?" It wasn't accusatory, more uncertain, as if asking for confirmation of something that didn't quite compute. Avery gave a tight nod, resisting the urge to sigh. "Yes. First Officer James. I'm on the manifest." The agent smiled quickly, embarrassed, and handed the ID back. "Of course. Welcome aboard." But the damage had already been done. Another tiny cut in a long line of paper cuts. She walked down the jet bridge toward the aircraft, a familiar calm settling over her as the noise of the terminal faded behind her. This was the space where she came alive. Not the hallways filled with doubting glances, but the cockpit. The switches, the systems, the silence of focus. Once that door closed, it didn't matter what anyone had assumed. In the air, respect wasn't given. It was earned. With every checklist, every calculation, every flawless landing. And that was where Avery James was about to remind the world, again, exactly who she was. The first time Avery James flew a plane, she didn't tell anyone. Not her friends, not her extended family, not even her closest mentor. She kept it to herself, like a secret too precious to expose, too delicate to risk being dismissed with a laugh or a raised eyebrow. She was 19, seated beside a retired Air Force pilot who volunteered at a community flight school for underrepresented youth. The plane was a single-engine Cessna, patched and sun-bleached from years in the hangar, but to her, it may as well have been a starship. The moment the wheels lifted from the tarmac, her stomach dropped with the motion, but her soul rose with something else entirely. Fear melted into focus. Her hands, trembling at first, found their strength wrapped around the yoke. As the ground slipped away beneath her, so did doubt. But euphoria doesn't shield you from the weight that follows. After that day, Avery dedicated herself to the cockpit with a quiet ferocity. She signed up for every available training hour, every simulation, every manual she could get her hands on. At night, while others partied or scrolled through endless feeds, she sat in her apartment surrounded by aviation charts, checklists, and laminated diagrams of aircraft systems. She knew she had to be more than good. She had to be undeniable. Her instructors rarely told her she was wrong, but they also rarely told her she was right. Their praise was rationed, their feedback clinical. Meanwhile, her white male classmates got high fives, casual inside jokes, and a confidence that didn't need to be earned. During one group simulator exercise in her second semester, the scenario was a simulated engine fire mid-air. Something complex but manageable with training. She took the lead, issuing commands to her crew, scanning the virtual controls, and preparing for an emergency descent. Just as she was reaching for the right switch, one of her teammates, a tall, broad-shouldered guy with a football player's swagger and the loud confidence of someone used to being heard, leaned across her and flipped the switch himself. "Let me just take it from here," he muttered, brushing her off like an assistant. The instructor, watching from behind the glass, said nothing. Avery froze for a second, not out of shock, but out of calculation. If she protested, she'd be labeled difficult. If she stayed silent, she'd be ignored. She smiled thinly, stepped back, and waited. After the session ended, the instructor nodded toward the team and offered only one comment: work on communication. That night, she stayed alone in the simulator after everyone had left. The janitor had turned off the lights in the hallway, but she was still inside, illuminated only by the soft glow of the cockpit instruments. She repeated the same emergency protocol over and over, drilling herself into the muscle memory of it. Every button, every lever, every radio call. She whispered the checklist under her breath like a prayer. Not because anyone demanded it of her, but because she knew that someday she would have to land a plane under pressure, and there would be no one in the room to trust but herself. She couldn't afford to freeze when it counted. She couldn't afford to prove herself when the moment came. She had to be ready, without hesitation. As the night wore on, the parking lot emptied, and she finally exited the building, the cold air hitting her like a wake-up call. She walked past a group of her peers who didn't notice her. They were laughing about something, probably harmless, probably unimportant. But she felt the distance between their world and hers like a canyon. She didn't resent them. She just didn't belong to them. And in a way, that became her strength. Because Avery wasn't training to be accepted. She was training to be airborne, untouchable, unshakable, undeniable. And one day, they would all know it. By the time Avery James reached the end of her flight training and applied to the commercial airline graduate program, her record was spotless. Her instructors, though never overly generous with praise, couldn't find a single technical flaw in her evaluations. Her flight hours were well above the requirement. Her simulator performance was in the top percentile. Her emergency drills had been so consistent that one examiner wrote, almost begrudgingly, "She flies like she's been doing it for a decade." But even as she gathered letters of recommendation and updated her resume, Avery knew, without being told, that the interview room would be another kind of test entirely. Not a test of skill, but of composure, of control, of her ability to swallow microaggressions like vitamins. She knew what she looked like on paper, but she also knew what she looked like in person to the men and women who had never flown beside someone like her. The airline office was modern, sterile, and expensive, all glass and brushed steel. She arrived 10 minutes early in a crisp navy suit, her pilot wings neatly pinned above the left pocket. As she sat in the waiting area, she watched as two other applicants were called in. Both white men, both younger, both clearly nervous. She wasn't. Nerves had been replaced long ago by a sort of quiet, practiced alertness. The receptionist smiled politely when she checked in, but Avery caught the double take when her name was confirmed. That pause, split second, involuntary, was the first indication. Not rude, just uncertain. When they finally called her name, she stepped into a room with three people seated across a conference table. Two men, one woman, all in their 40s or 50s, dressed like they'd just come from an investor meeting. They barely made eye contact when she entered. One of the men glanced down at her resume, then at her face, and let out a soft, almost inaudible hum. He leaned back in his chair, hands steepled, and said, "You're Avery James." Not a question, just disbelief dressed as confirmation. Avery met his gaze without flinching, offering a professional nod. "That's correct." They began with standard questions. She answered each one clearly, efficiently. She walked them through flight logs, mechanical systems, altitude management, and real-world problem-solving. At one point, she described a time she had executed a short-field landing with a crosswind so unpredictable it had spooked her co-pilot. The woman on the panel raised an eyebrow and asked, "Were you the one in command for that landing?" Avery replied without hesitation, "Yes, and I took responsibility for every decision made in that cockpit." As the question shifted from technical to personal, the tone subtly changed. One man leaned forward and asked with an almost fatherly tone, "So, what inspired you to become a pilot?" She knew that question. It was loaded, meant to sound warm, but designed to make her human, to ground her in some emotional narrative. She obliged briefly, mentioning childhood dreams, the community program that gave her a start, but she ended the story quickly, redirecting it back to discipline and skill. They wanted vulnerability. She offered them facts. Then came the question she'd been waiting for. The older man folded his arms and asked, "Have you ever considered applying to our flight attendant program? With your communication skills and your calm presence, you might be a real asset there." The words hung in the air for a moment. The woman beside him didn't react. The other man glanced down at his notes. Avery kept her face still. Her pulse didn't change. She looked him directly in the eye and replied, "No, sir, I've trained as a pilot. I intend to fly your aircraft, not serve drinks on them." Her tone was even, not defensive, and that was what made it land like a blade. The panel didn't speak for a few seconds. Then they nodded, jotted things down, and wrapped up the interview with the usual lines. "We'll be in touch. We appreciate your time. It's a competitive program." Avery shook each of their hands with a firmness that neither challenged nor apologized. She walked out of the building with her spine straight, her chin level, and her mind already focused on next steps, because she knew she wouldn't get in on charm or familiarity. She wouldn't benefit from anyone seeing themselves in her. If they chose her, it would be reluctantly, and only because they couldn't deny her credentials. 3 days later, the email arrived. "Congratulations! You've been selected for the trainee program." No enthusiasm. No exclamation point. No personal message. Just the facts. And still, Avery sat at her kitchen table for a long moment, staring at the screen, letting the quiet victory settle in. They didn't want her, but they needed her. And once she had her wings, they'd never forget why. Every morning, Avery James slipped into the pilot's lounge at dawn, greeted not by applause, but by polite nods from colleagues who scarcely registered her presence, their conversations swirling around aircraft mechanics and weather charts as though she were part of the furniture, rather than a fellow aviator with equal authority. She moved through the ritual, coffee in hand, flight plan review at her seat, pre-flight briefing at the podium, with a quiet determination born of years spent proving her worth in silence. In the cockpit, She settled into her co-pilot's seat aboard the regional jets assigned to her. Short hops between secondary airports that carried few eyes or headlines, and listened to the captain's pre-flight banter, offering input on wind shear or fuel management only to have her voice politely drowned out by the veteran pilot's practiced anecdotes. They never questioned her knowledge, but neither did they include her in strategy, as if her ideas were invisible until the engines roared and the checklist demanded her attention. Still, in those hours above the clouds, Avery's focus sharpened. She memorized every gauge, anticipated every pattern shift, and logged every minute with precision so perfect that her performance reviews praised her quiet competence as though that were faint praise rather than the hallmark of a pilot unflappable even under duress. Outside the cockpit door, passengers boarded without a backward glance at the woman who would guide them safely through turbulence, but Avery regarded their trust as her true badge of honor. She knew that respect was not granted in the terminal or the briefing room, but earned in the blue expanse where skill spoke louder than uniform. By flying these humble routes day after day, routes that carried those least likely to notice a woman of color at the controls, she built a record so impeccable that no one could continue to overlook her. And whether they saw her in their departure lounge or simply felt the smooth landing she delivered time and again, Avery James was becoming impossible to ignore. When Flight 428 climbed out of Denver at dawn, few passengers paid attention to the cockpit beyond the casual nod they received when boarding. But for Avery James, this routine cross-country run was another step in her unending quest for mastery, a chance to prove that every takeoff and every landing mattered no matter the altitude. Stationed at the right seat as first officer, she and her captain ran through the pre-flight checklist with synchronized precision. His gravelly voice offering anecdotes from 30 years in the air while she inputted data into the FMC, eyes scanning instruments as the runway lights receded beneath them. Midway over the endless expanse of Kansas wheat fields, the smooth hum of the engines was shattered by the abrupt collapse of the seasoned captain, his hand clutching his chest before he slumped in his seat, the intercom crackling as the flight attendant's urgent voice called, "Is there a doctor on board?" But the cockpit door remained closed, and Avery's mind snapped into action without a second thought, her fingers flying over controls as she engaged the autopilot altitude hold. Checked. The captain's pulse in a swift motion born of simulator drills, then reached for the emergency medical kit as the first officer with training beyond the ordinary, keeping her voice calm for the cabin and for air traffic control. Denver Center, this is First Officer James, Flight 428. Captain incapacitated. Request vectors for the nearest diversion runway. Airport radar hesitated before clearing her to land at Wichita, where emergency crews would be waiting, and as she managed descent speeds, flaps, and gear with the same meticulous care she had shown. For every landing practice, passengers gripped armrests and murmured prayers, the two flight attendants exchanging wide-eyed glances while Avery relayed clear, confident instructions, her voice steady above the storm of adrenaline. At 20,000 feet, turbulence from an unexpected storm cell rattled the aircraft, but she threaded through it, nothing improvised, everything by the book, concluding the landing checklist with crisp precision. Despite the unplanned nature of her command, there was no hesitation, no panic, only the disciplined execution of every protocol she had learned during those long nights in the simulator where no one ever doubted the woman in the cockpit. When the wheels touched the runway and the brakes slowed the aircraft to a rolling stop, a collective gasp rose from the cabin, followed by stunned silence, punctuated by a lone, heartfelt round of applause as shaken passengers realized who had guided them down safely. Medical personnel flooded the jet bridge, and Avery stepped out of the cockpit, her face calm but resolute, acknowledging the passengers' grateful smiles before slipping back into uniform, as though this act of command had simply been the next logical sentence in her lifelong story of proving that skill not stereotype, truly defines a pilot. When Avery James finally taxied onto the wet tarmac of Wichita Dwight D. Eisenhower National Airport, her hands still tingling from adrenaline, the tower controller's voice crackled in her headset with an edge she hadn't heard before. Equal parts skepticism and impatience. Flight 428, verify you are First Officer James and not an unauthorized pilot, he demanded, as if the safe arrival of 200 souls hadn't just been orchestrated. Avery didn't hesitate. She flipped off the runway lights with the throttle, cleared the brakes, and replied evenly, "Confirmed. Wichita Tower. This is First Officer Avery James. Captain is in medical care. I have the aircraft." She could almost feel his raised eyebrow through the radio as he barked, "Do you even know what you're doing up there? Conditions are deteriorating. Crosswinds gusting 30 knots, visibility down to half a mile. Are you qualified to handle a 737 in this?" The cabin had fallen silent, passengers peering forward as if they, too, could hear the challenge in his tone. In that moment, Avery closed her eyes for a heartbeat, not out of fear, but to steady her senses, and then reopened them to the stormy windshield. Every scar on that glass, every saturated runway marker, every warning light loomed larger in her mind, but none of it surprised her. She had drilled this scenario in simulators at odd hours, when nobody was watching, until the muscle memory of it was sharper than doubt. "Request final approach, runway 27L, she responded crisply, leaning forward to engage flaps and slats in proper sequence, her voice betraying nothing but calm authority. She navigated the gusts by angling the nose into the wind, compensating for drift with subtle rudder inputs, the autopilot disengaging under her confident hands as the jet bucked against the turbulence. In the cabin, flight attendants steadied themselves on their jump seats, exchanging glances that mixed relief with newfound respect. Avery's focus narrowed to the front window, the runway lights winking through sheets of rain, the pavement shimmering like obsidian. With one last check of airspeed and descent rate, she guided the 737 onto the center line, feeling the wheels kiss the ground in a whisper rather than the crash one might expect, then applied reverse thrust and lowered the nose gently to maintain traction. As the aircraft slowed to a halt, the tower fell silent for a long beat before a single voice broke through. "Flight 428, that was exemplary. Welcome to Wichita." Avery exhaled, wiped a bead of moisture from her brow, and smiled privately. She didn't need their approval. She had already proven, in the sky above the storm, exactly what she was capable of. When the cabin door opened and Avery James stepped out of the cockpit, her uniform crisp despite the storm, and her face composed but resolute, the passengers who had been shaken and silent suddenly realized that it was not the captain, but the young first officer who had brought them safely through wind shear and torrential rain. And as the emergency crews hustled around the plane, checking equipment and guiding her to a waiting ambulance for the incapacitated captain, a hush fell over those 20 rows of seats, punctuated only by the quick clicks of camera phones and the soft rustle of credit cards as grateful travelers settled their unexpected hotel bills. No public announcement followed, no ticker tape parade, just the quiet awe of men and women who slowly began to murmur among themselves about the precision of her flair, the steadiness of her hands, and the calm in her voice. And one elderly gentleman in a navy overcoat, his eyes still wet with relief, approached her on the jet bridge and said softly, "I didn't think a black girl could land a plane, but you just proved me wrong," to which Avery offered a curt nod and a gentle smile. Before disappearing into the orderly chaos of medical personnel, leaving behind a charged silence that spread beyond the airplane to the control tower where controllers exchanged impressed looks, to the airline's lounge where pilots who had previously ignored her prowess now spoke her name in respectful tones, and to the flight attendant break room where, instead of hushed gossip, colleagues hailed her as an example of unwavering skill, for true recognition had arrived not with headlines or fanfare, but in the silent, profound shift of doubt into respect that followed every conversation about Flight 428. Months passed, and the story of Flight 428 became a quiet legend among the corridors of every major airline. But for Avery James, the real moment of triumph came not in the debriefing rooms or the hushed applause of colleagues, but on a windy Saturday morning at the local high school auditorium, where she stood behind a simple podium in worn jeans and a crisp white blouse. The same student-run career day that had once suggested nursing as a more reachable goal now packed wall-to-wall with girls of every background, their eyes wide as they watched her pin her 4 stripes to the lapel of her blazer. She began not with technical jargon or tales of in-flight emergencies, but with a single memory of herself at 12, gazing skyward and believing the impossible. And as she spoke of persistence, preparation, and the power of refusing to be unseen, the room hung on every word, each sentence weaving together the truth that every glass cockpit she ever entered, every flight plan she ever filed, had led to this moment of connection. When she invited questions, a hand shot up immediately. How did you stay calm when no one believed you could do it? And Avery smiled, recalling every late-night drill and every subtle dismissal, then answered honestly, "I flew for the people who thought I couldn't," drawing a ripple of laughter and cheers. And later that afternoon, as she watched the students file out with renewed purpose in their steps, she realized that her greatest landing wasn't on rainy runways, but in hearts and minds, where she had forever changed the trajectory of dreams, proving at last that a black girl not only could fly planes, but belonged in the sky above them all.